Well, I want to start this sermon with a test. I'm going to present to you a scenario, and I want you to mull it over in your mind. Don't blurt out your answer, but just come up with an answer in your mind, kind of a riddle of sorts, and then we'll do an evaluation of it. So let me give you a scenario. The scenario is this. A woman, while at the funeral of her own mother, met a man whom she did not know. She started talking with this man. She found him to be amazing, the man of her dreams, so much so that she fell in love with him immediately. But she forgot to ask him for his number. And once the funeral was over, he went on his way and she went on her way, and she was unable to find him afterwards. Now, a few days later, she killed her own sister. So the question for you is, what is her motive in killing her sister? Here's the answer. She was hoping that the man would appear again at her sister's funeral. Now, if you answered this question correctly, psychologists tell us that you think like a psychopath. And that this test was once administered by an American psychologist in his interview of serial killers. If you answered it correctly, let me know in private. I'll make sure I never cross you. Now, in all seriousness, I want us to think a bit about murder, because the passage we're going to be studying today starts with a recognition, as we all would recognize, that murder is among the most heinous, horrifying sins that a person could ever commit. Murder is wrong. We all agree with that. Murder is a horrendous sin against another human being. But interestingly, as Jesus instructs us in the Sermon on the Mount, he reminds us that there is something that is equally evil, and that is unrighteous anger. Because unrighteous anger is a precursor to murder. Unrighteous anger is a precursor to numerous sins that we might commit. And as shocking as it might seem, Jesus presses us very hard in this lesson on anger by wanting us to equate it in our minds with murder, to want to avoid it like we might want to avoid what we should avoid murder, to want us to think of it as equally heinous so that we do not allow it to linger or brew in our lives unattended. And I understand that from a human perspective, it might seem like a bit of an exaggeration for Jesus to speak that way. After all, how could murder possibly be equated with anger? How could anger possibly be put on the same level as murder? Well, according to Jesus, anger at its core has a murderous principle attached. It wants not the best, but the worst for another human being. As we are studying the Gospel of Matthew, we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 21. And in verses 21 through 22, first of all, Jesus reminds us of the problem with anger. So in verse 21, he says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder.'" And you can imagine everyone's like, "Yeah, I've heard that. It's in the Decalogue. It's in the 10 Commandments. I get it. Everybody knows you shouldn't murder. And whoever murders will be liable to judgment." Yep, get it. That makes sense. I understand. That's what I would expect Jesus to teach such things. But then we have verse 22. But Jesus is about to say something jarring here. "I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire. That is rather blunt of Jesus to say such things. Verse 21, we would expect. Verse 22 seems a little harsh. But what Jesus is doing is he's trying to help us to think through some of the emotions that undergird murder or murderous intent. Now, you've probably heard it said, if you've been in church for a while, that there's two kinds of anger. There is such a thing as righteous anger. We'll comment on that a little bit more. But righteous anger is the kind of anger that God shows toward sin. But then there is also unrighteous anger. Now, righteous anger was displayed by our own Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, famously in the temple when he became angered at all the cheaters and connivers that had turned this house of worship into a house of ill repute for the purpose of financial gain. Of course, we would want to encourage you to have a righteous anger against social injustices, against ungodliness, against the wanton destruction of human life, against infanticide, against children that are being abused by their parents or caregivers. These would be the kind of things we would want to have an angry response to, an anger, a disdain for these kinds of sins, because these things actually destroy life. But it's a whole different ball game to be angry at someone without righteous cause to the point that you would want their death, their downfall. This is what Jesus is about to discuss with us in his Sermon on the Mount. This is a whole different animal. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Anger is never without a reason, but seldom with a good one." Think about that for a moment. Anger is never without a reason, but seldom with a good one. It's so easy to justify our anger toward other people. Well, if you only knew what they did to me, or said about me, or didn't do for me, or if you had only been married to her for 25, 30, 40 years, you would sympathize with me a little bit more. Yet oftentimes when we truly assess ourselves in light of God's standards, we realize that our anger is very selfish. It's not loving, it doesn't desire the best for the other, and it most certainly doesn't honor and glorify God. Sometimes we have reasons to be angry, but more often than not, our anger is merely a symptom of our raw, selfish, me-oriented humanity. Murder is one of the ultimate expressions of disrespect for another human life. And at the end of this first statement, you can almost envision Jesus' audience when he declared to them what we have recorded in Matthew 5 as verse 21. You can almost hear them saying, preach it, Jesus. Correct false teachers, correct the murderous among us, subject them to judgment. You can also imagine maybe their brows starting to furrow and them getting a little bit uncomfortable and maybe shifting in their seats or shuffling in their sandals when Jesus delivers that second statement to them. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, hellfire, of course, is an extreme punishment, which underscores the extreme nature of godless anger. Jesus' message to us illustrates that a person has not been conformed to the values of the kingdom of heaven if they permit unrighteous anger to linger in their lives. That means that if you discipline your children out of unrighteous anger, you need to confess that to the Lord. That means that if you are an angry citizen, not governed by anger at social evil, but if you're just angry at whoever's in power, no matter what the circumstances are, because perhaps you think you could do it better, or whatever your reason might be, you need to confess that to the Lord. If you are an angry employee, hissing and whispering and undermining your employer behind their back. You need to confess that to the Lord. If you are an angry driver, this is where we're going to get real personal. If you're an angry driver, God knows these things. Now, murder might be rather easy for a court to identify, to provide evidence for, and to penalize. But what about unrighteous anger? It might be bottled up inside and nobody really sees it. No one's really quite sure. Is this man or woman governed by righteousness or unrighteousness? And even as we try to assess our own selves, it's like, well, I don't know. Like, am I righteously angry or is my anger of the flesh? It can be difficult to judge our inner anger, but God knows the true you. God knows what your motives are. If you're on the outs with another brother, if you're on the outs with your spouse, with another church member, with someone in your community, God knows your true intentions. God knows your true heart. And if God sees that underlying seething rage that is all too often present in our lives, he wants us to be able to address that and wean it out of our lives. Now, there's plenty of reasons why we might rationalize away our anger. There are things that threaten us. There are things that frustrate us. There are expectations that are often not met. In my own personal life, as I've assessed myself for anger, in my own pastoral work, as I've assessed anger in others, some of the most common ones are anger from parents toward their children. Seething anger, rage, directed toward their children. Now, if you've been a parent for longer than a week, you know that children very quickly learn to push all the right buttons. There's plenty of reasons why your children might make you incredibly angry, but we have to be careful. Do we respond reactively or proactively? Do we respond out of rage or do we respond with our values and our principles intact? Oftentimes, as children grow and get into those teen years, the temptation to grow angry is amplified because teens are transitioning from dependence to independence, and they can often make foolish decisions and really get us worked up. I remember there's a few times when I was raising my kids. For 6 months, we had 5 teenagers in the home. There was times when they were pressing my buttons. And I could feel myself getting angry, and I remember having at times to apologize to them for that because I realized I was in the fault to a greater degree than they were. People's anger towards government, spouses off to court to file for divorce. How many divorces could be mitigated, could be avoided if people just learned to love and forgive and have a meaningful conversation with their spouse? People angry with someone else in the church, storming out because your needs aren't met, or you don't feel heard, or you feel maybe you were overlooked. That can happen. But here's the thing, these problems will never go away in a fallen world. We're never going to be able to fix these problems, but we can govern our emotional responses to these things. Now, Jesus understands this about our humanity. And so this command against godless anger is something for us to heed, something for us to consider. We need to spend time mulling over our inner thoughts, our attitudes, realizing and remembering that our inner thoughts and our attitudes are subject to the scrutiny of God. Yes, there are times when people need to be rebuked for something they have done that is foolish. There are times when something can be identified as idiotic. The word fool does have a place in the Christian vernacular. The Bible says the fool says in his heart there is no God. Nabal's wife said, my husband is true to he's a fool. There's times when the word fool is righteously applied, but in this context, this is not a prohibition against ever using the word fool, but it is a prohibition against using it in anger directing it toward a brother, accusing that brother of essentially godlessness, which is the nature of ultimate foolishness. Judging that person. Maybe that person isn't even a believer. And in our anger, we can often let words like that escape from our mouths that really diminish that person's humanity and label them with labels that are inappropriate. So it's important to understand that this teaching is not a taboo against using strong words. Jesus is not saying when you open your mouth as Christians, you always got to have low decibels, soft, fluffy terminology when addressing people. Sometimes you need to name the sin and call people out and be blunt and be courageous with your words. But it is a command to guard our hearts, to exercise self-control, to be patient in working with people. As parents, we have often told our children something like, don't say this, or don't say that, that's a bad word, or I don't want to hear that come out of your mouth. But have we taken a suitable amount of time to help them to process the internal dynamics that may be taking place in their lives? It's not enough just to correct outward behavior. We need to help our children, the next generation, process the internal dimensions of their lives. It's not enough just to say, hey, don't take a knife and stab people. It's not enough just to say, I don't want to see you murdering people. What about the internal dimensions? Jesus is addressing an internal sin that often goes unnoticed in our lives. Jesus reminds us, as we should remind others, that human anger, whether it's expressed in curses or name-calling or seething hatred toward another person, has no place in the kingdom of God. So that's the problem of evil. It's exposed. But Jesus also presents us with the solution to anger. He identifies the problem, and then he introduces us to the solution. And in order to do that, Jesus gives us two illustrations out of which we can extract three principles to help us to keep a cool head and to deal with anger in our own lives. You'll see these taught to us in verse 23 and following. Here's the first one. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, now we don't have an altar, but keep in mind he's speaking to people in the first century. They were still going to the temple. They would go to the inner court. They would have their offering put there. So we need to translate it into the new covenant context. Just, you could read it this way. If you're in public worship, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. So in other words, don't just kind of continue on and worship because that's the thing to do. If you have unresolved hatred toward another, first be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So, the first illustration deals with an offense that a believing brother or sister has committed against the other. And Jesus is saying, whether you want to admit it or not, that will inevitably and necessarily affect your worship. So you have to deal with it. And the second illustration deals with someone in a context where you are so polarized that it could lead to legal consequences. Probably the most common example of this is divorce, where Christian spouses cannot reconcile, they refuse to reconcile, and they end up spending all kinds of money in divorce courts because they have one or both have failed to follow the basic principles that govern relationships. Reconciliation, forgiveness, long-suffering, patience, fidelity, these sorts of things. But it can extend beyond that. It could be a a conflict with a neighbor or a business partner. And just so we understand what's going on here, it doesn't mean that both parties are necessarily at fault. It doesn't mean that both parties are equally at fault. But in Jesus' illustrations here, the assumption is that you are the one that has the anger issue that has resulted from one of these scenarios cropping up in your life. Now, while most of us are concerned about how others have offended us, isn't that true? We're very quickly aware when someone has offended us. That's our human nature. Someone says something that's off-putting, we immediately recognize it in our own lives, but it's not as necessarily easy for us to recognize when we've offended another person. So we recognize when the offense is directed toward us, but one of the underlying implications that Jesus is pressing us to consider is that we should be equally, perhaps even more concerned about how our anger and our hatred incites others. So here are some principles that arise out of these two illustrations. So the first one is the principle of consequences. There are very real consequences attached to unresolved hatred, anger, disdain for another human being. It's not relationally neutral stuff. There's consequences attached to it. And the first and most significant consequence is it will literally ruin your worship. Good luck fully enjoying fellowship with God if you're on the outs with other believers. I mean, you can almost feel it in your worship life when your marriage isn't quite where it needs to be. You just can't worship as well as when you're in harmonious relationships. When there's feuding among church leaders or church members or in church denominations. It's not like you can just put that aside and come in and just freely worship God and enjoy the fruits of Christian worship. We might think, well, maybe the answer is I just need to attend more or sing louder to try to avoid it. Or work myself up into an emotional lather to try to bury or avoid the pain of my own hatred toward another. But in actual fact, God's solution is very simple. Make it right as best as you are able. If you are at odds with your boss, your children, your husband, your wife, a fellow believer, due to your actions, things will never be right with you and God until you apologize to the degree that you are able to apologize and make things right. Let me put it to you bluntly. If you want a better worship life, you need to ask not forgiveness, first of all, from God, which might sound kind of odd to say, but it's evidently true. You need to ask others for forgiveness. Doesn't the Lord's Prayer say something about that? Forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive others. And yet sometimes we have this notion, well, as long as I'm right with God, I can be on the outs with everyone, everything's fine. It's not true. This axis in life, our relationships, affects this axis in life, our relationship with God. Inevitably, they're always intertwined. And so if you want to increase your worship life, you need to make sure, again, to the degree that you are able, to make things right with anyone to whom you are at odds. Now, in the second, the consequences may go beyond just relational disputes or schism in a church to legal issues, possibly even jail time. Think of how many crimes have been committed as a result of rage, explosive anger, hatred. Think of how many families have been ruined because of it. When a person's mind is not steadied on kingdom values, love for others, love for God, forgiveness, good solid communication revolving around truth, elevating truth, getting rid of lies, the potential for irrational outbursts, jealousy, rage, misunderstanding are huge. How many times have each of us, I'll throw myself under the bus too, have been driven to anger or said something we later regretted because we just refused to be patient and have the conversation that needed to be had. We need to keep our anger under control or risk serious consequences. If you despise another person for whatever reason, you're going to have to do business with God. But in certain cases, you might even end up in court. A lady once said to the famous evangelist who's now with the Lord, Billy Sunday, she tried to rationalize, who's preaching on anger, she tried to rationalize her angry outbursts, and she said to him, well, there's nothing wrong with losing my temper. She said, I blow up and then it's all over, it's gone. And his response was quick. He says, well, so does a shotgun. And look at the damage it leaves behind. So don't rationalize it. If there's anger in your life toward another believer, deal with it. It genuinely and legitimately affects our worship. The second principle is the principle of speed. The Chinese have a proverb that goes like this: the fastest horse cannot catch a word spoken in anger. When that word comes out, one of those cutting words, one of those mean words, one of those hateful words, it's difficult to take them back. That's why speed is of the essence when it comes to reconciliation. The worst thing you can do is wait and delay and drag it on. Because then further damage, insult is added to injury, as we say. In the first instance, we are instructed to cease worshiping until the offense has been made right. And in the second, we are told to come to terms quickly with our adversary. And in both circumstances, both in our worship and in our interpersonal relationships, the principle rings out loud and clear. Do not delay. Do not wait. Deal with your anger as fast as you possibly can. Don't wait a week. You don't need to go off and pray about it for 6 months in a monastery. Deal with the issue as fast as you can. Make the call. Have the conversation. Make things right as fast and as expediently as you can. Instead of taking the easy way out, you make the call, even if you're not fully to blame. Even if the other person legitimately has done something that is wrong. Make the phone call, have the cup of coffee, reconcile to the degree that you are able. This is crucial to minimizing the damage that is done and beginning the healing process. It's the same with our physical bodies, right? If you see an open wound on your hand, you don't think to yourself, well, it'll be there in a week. I'll get around to dealing with it. You deal with it as soon as possible, because if you don't, maybe infection will set in and suddenly you're at jeopardy of losing your hand or your arm or your life. You deal with it quickly because anger has a way of spreading and destroying and bringing destruction like gangrene. The third principle is the principle of your testimony. So in the first instance, our testimony before God is at stake. Our sacrifices, our worship is hindered or worthless. But there's also your testimony to the watching world, your public testimony, your social testimony is at stake. We might be viewed as angry people, which would cause people to withdraw from us. We might end up incarcerated, which wouldn't be good. We might end up fined, which wouldn't be good. But if we say that we're a believer in Christ, we will deal with the issue. So as you think about this, you might still be trying to figure out, is anger sinful? Well, again, not godly anger. There's a place for righteous anger in our lives. We should have emotional sensitivity. Our emotions are part of how God has designed us. We want to have emotions. That's how God has designed us. We just need to direct them and bridle them properly. One Christian preacher said, anger is a divinely implanted emotion closely allied to our instinct for right. It is designed to be used for constructive spiritual purposes. The person who cannot feel anger at evil is a person who lacks enthusiasm for good. If you cannot hate wrong, it's very questionable whether you really love righteousness, end quote. So there's a place for righteous anger. But human anger is wrong and destructive. It does not reflect a life saturated by kingdom values. The Bible speaks out against this misused emotion many times. Let me take you to a couple other passages. We'll start with 2 Corinthians 12. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. Paul is concerned for the Corinthian church. Why? Because he knows that even in good Christian churches, these things can take hold of us. We're not immune to these things, brothers and sisters. This is why we need preaching like this. We need to deal with these issues. Anger is just as wrong as jealousy. Galatians 5:20, a similar list: idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, and divisions. Again, this is the apostle warning Christians. This is not stuff that the world struggles with alone. We also struggle with it. Think about this. Anger is in the same list with sorcery, witchcraft. It's in the same list. It's a serious matter. Ephesians 4:26, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger, which is the exact same principle that Jesus is teaching in Matthew 5. Deal with it quick. Be expedient. Resolve the issue. There's anger. It says be angry. But then there's sinful anger. But do not sin. How about Colossians 3:8? But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. And it makes me wonder if in this specific context, he's not thinking back to what Jesus said in Matthew 5. Fool, moron, idiot. It's names that we might apply to someone to diminish their humanity because we hate them. We must learn to not only suppress this natural tendency, but to weed it out of our lives, to ask God to forgive us and to sanctify us and to cleanse us from this prevailing relational sin. So perhaps now would be a good time for you to do, if you haven't been doing it already, a little self-evaluation. How are you doing in this area of your life, brother or sister? Just assess your relationships. How about in your marriage, if you're a married person? How about with your children, if you're a parent? Hey, kids, how about with your mom or dad? How about with your business partners or colleagues or the people you work with? How are you doing in this area? Are you an angry person? Or do you love people? Dealing with the issues, that's good. Having the hard conversations, but do you love people? Do you want the best for them, even if you're not particularly pleased with their behavior? Are you keeping short accounts with God in this area? Are you prepared to go to God and say, Lord, forgive me of my trespasses as I forgive those that have trespassed against me? May God make us each more patient, loving people. May God enable us to differentiate between righteous anger and unrighteous anger. And you know one of the best ways to remind ourselves of this? Think deeply and regularly about God's grace toward you. Because God has plenty of reasons to strike me dead. God has plenty of reasons to be angry with this guy for the sins I've committed. But God has been incredibly gracious and merciful toward me. He still confronts me for my sin. He still disciplines me because I'm one of his children. He doesn't turn a blind eye to evil. We're not suggesting here that we need to turn a blind eye to evil. But we also need to pour on the grace and the mercy and consider God's grace toward us. May these words benefit you personally in your walk with Christ. And may these words also benefit you in your relationships with your fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord.